Welcome back, everyone, to Caster Calls with ZombieGrub. It is episode 59, and I have Chobra with me. I feel like the one and only Chobra. Huge name in esports. Certainly, if you were a StarCraft fan, which I know many of you are, then you recognize the name, but just general esports, or especially anything, I guess, Korean. You know this guy.
Yeah,
So,
that would do it.
yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. And I guess, how are you doing in general? What's been the recent Chobra life?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, probably the news has been a little quiet if you aren't following certain games. So I've been all right. I'm currently in Korea. For those who didn't know, obviously a lot of you know I worked at ESL for a while in America, but I'm back in Korea. And the most recent things I've been doing is mostly commentating Valorant. So commentating the Valorant challengers here in Korea, VCT Korea. And then also now getting back into Korean commentating for the international events, like I used to do for League of Legends way back when. That's been the bulk of it, right? Some other small things here and there, but the main thing that fills up my whole year is Valorant right now.
And Valorant, I'm sure we'll get into, how well it's doing right now and all the jobs that's involved. And we are actually already talked a little bit about some of the burning questions I had, so we'll probably reiterate some of that I asked you about back when I was in Korea on this podcast. But yeah, we do generally start off with your introduction into video games and then, of course, esports, which I'm pretty sure I actually just don't know. So this will be a great tale for me to listen to as well.
Gotcha. So for me, video games, they've always kind of been there, but my parents were generally strict when I was a kid. So, there was like strict times on when I could use the computer for gaming or any of the consoles I had in the past. And then it kind of really changed for me as a hobby starting in high school because I used to play violin. That used to kind of be my career path plan. And because I would have to practice during the day, because of like noise complaints, the only thing I could do with my friends was, online gaming. That kind of became the default. So that's, I think, when I really started getting into gaming, because before that it was all single player or obviously just like it was for most people, just consoles back at home in front of the TV with friends. So I started getting into online gaming then. And then for esports, there are a couple steps there. So I first discovered League of Legends through one of my old Call of Duty clans. And then, I started enjoying it. And then obviously that was kind of when PC esports was kind of coming back in America, right? With League of Legends and then Dota 2 and then StarCraft 2. Three kind of big three kind of came together and made the boom happen again for PC esports. And I had always been very interested in broadcasting of any type, whether it's TV, news, radio. Radio has always been a big thing for me. That's always been on my head, whether it's production itself, commentating, whatever it could be. So when I started to take a break from college, initially, the first couple months I kind of just spent playing Dota 2 extensively, or learning Dota 2, I guess is the proper way to put it. And then at a certain point, I was like, well, okay, esports is now getting big in the West again. It's always kind of had a steady flow in Korea, but why not give it a shot, right? It combines one of my hobbies with one of my biggest interests. Initially I had considered wanting to go into like an analyst or coaching role in League of Legends, but at the time, something about learning Dota 2 was much more enticing for me. I just had a lot more fun studying the game, learning the game, discovering the depth of the game, partly probably because it was newer for me. But in Dota 2 at the time was still in beta. So it was still in that mode where it was mostly people who were already involved in Dota that were coming over, kind of figuring out how to build this thing together. So there wasn't much room especially for someone like me who was just learning the game, right, to get into it at the time. So went back to League of Legends, which was also budding, but obviously I was much more familiar with the game. I started doing a bunch of just like, picking up whatever I could. I'd go on Reddit. People would be like, we're doing a community tournament. I'd be like, hey, can I like stream and commentate this? And whether anyone watches or not, and I get paid in like a $10 gift card. I'm like, yeah, let's go. Like, let's do this thing. And I cast it on my own. Started doing a couple of community projects with a couple other kind of budding commentators. We had found each other at the time. And the big boost was I was living in Jersey at the time, taking a break from school in New York. And MLG was having their first and now only League of Legends Summer Arena. So I know they had this a couple times for StarCraft 2, but they were just trying this with League of Legends. And I remember the year before, one of my friends from school in college had met some of the StarCraft 2 pros from Korea because they were at the MLG office for the Winter Arena, I believe, the year before, and they just like met up in K-Town. They were like, "Oh, that's so crazy." So in my head, I was like, okay, well, maybe there's a chance I can like run into these League of Legends teams, especially because I believe at that time their sponsor was the Zubu Blaze was coming over as well as one of the Korean invites. So sorry about my dog if you can hear it, but there was a MLG Dr. Pepper sweepstake at the time. It was the ultimate fan giveaway. And basically, if you made a vlog and you got, the most votes, you would win a trip to the next MLG event, circuit event, which was MLG Rally 2012. And it had to be Dr. Pepper related. So my whole idea was, okay, let's film a vlog, or it could be any video, but let's film a vlog of me going to find the MLG offices and studios and hopefully meeting these League of Legends teams while only drinking Dr. Pepper. And I later found out it happened to be on the hottest day of the summer that year. So silly me decided to be very honest and only drink soda on the hottest day of the summer for a whole day on my trip into Manhattan. But thankfully, I was able to find the office, and I waited on the first floor and actually ended up meeting every team at the time that was there. And so I met some of the, huge casters that really took a big spot in the early days of League of Legends as well, like Monte Cristo. That's where I met Monty, Optimus Tom, D-Man, all these guys. So there was a whole group that I was looking up to and I wanted to kind of learn from that I could meet. And then one of them realized that I could speak Korean and translate. In fact, Slasher realized that I could translate. I know a name that is sometimes long forgotten, maybe intentionally by some people. But, I will forever be in debt to Slasher just because he was like, oh, you're like fluent. You should talk to the MLG guys. Like, I think, you could probably come up there and be of help. And so the next day, I mean, this was a non-public event, right? It's just at their studio. It's just broadcasted. It's just streamed. But the next day, the MLG guys were also just kind of in awe that someone would go to that length to make that video. So they just invited me up. I mean, obviously, there was no contract yet, so I couldn't do any work. But we got to talking, and that's basically where everything kicked off, right? I started writing articles for Monty's site at the time, GG Chronicle. I got in touch with the MLG guys, Puckett, namely, and he said, well, if you can translate, like, let's keep in touch, right? And then one of the members at the time, I believe now is still at Riot as well, who was also like, yeah, we're going to try to continue to do League of Legends events. If you can translate League of Legends, like, let's do this thing. And it all kicked off from there. Started doing interviews, eventually started casting a little bit for MLG when League of Legends was still run by a bunch of third parties. And then that eventually led to OGN, thanks to Monty and Doa, and me having worked with them a little bit and them knowing what I was capable of. And then the rest is history and quite public after that.
Yeah. I think you can go to your various Liquipedias of any game and see what's up. But that my timeline was, I guess, off then. I mean, it's now 10, 11 years ago, so it's kind of excusable. But yeah, I would have, I could have sworn that you were in there sooner than 2012 and 13. So this is a surprise to me. But I did want to clarify for the listeners out there, this MLG thing that you're talking about, there used to be like a studios in
Yeah.
and it was literally invite only. That also was where they experimented with a pay-per-view system,
Yes.
which was some people still argue it's before its time, maybe it'll come back again. And it was just like you had to go in there wasn't anything public, but I remember those guys, kind of just the entire company, they were pretty open still, even though at that time we were kind of like getting the expected, the usuals, the people who were going to be working at an event. They were still pretty open to kind of getting anyone who could do the job, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it wasn't like wild, wild west 2010 exactly, but it still had a little bit of the like, okay, well, you can do a job, get over here. So even I actually, one of my first offline events was like a guest cast at that same place because they
Ah,
were
right
just so
on.
chill about it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it helped start a lot of people's careers, I guess.
Yes.
Kind
Oh,
of
for sure.
momentous. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you brought up that I actually find very interesting, you said that you were interested in broadcasting
Yes.
before you were like really into anything else.
Hmm.
I guess esports wise, a lot of people fall into it accidentally and discover that they like it.
Yeah.
Or I guess I don't know, they have a bit more of a of a background in traditional sports anyways, but is that you? Why did you have this interest in broadcasting?
So you know what? I've actually never had someone ask why. Now that I think about it, if I were to try to reach back, I think for one, so I spent my younger childhood in Korea. I was born in the States, but I moved to Korea at an early age. I spent basically my kind of elementary years in Korea, and then I went back to the States for my teen years, and then onward, and then young adult. So I think growing up as a kid in Korea and just seeing that was when Korea was like just starting to really experiment with different variety shows, which are now very well known worldwide. But they were trying very different things, funky things, and I think I just really took a liking to that. And then
Mm,
also I've always really enjoyed actually listening to Korean radio, something I never really quite got used to in the States. I'd try now and then if I was on a drive, and there were certain stations that I liked, but a lot of Korean radio, just the default is much more kind of talk heavy, anecdotal, a lot of that rather than just
mhm.
music heavy, where is in my experience, at least the stations I had found in the States are mostly right the music, some news, right, but it's a lot of higher energy, obviously depending on the time of day. And I think I've always liked that there was this kind of conversational format in the Korean radio scene. And even when I played music, even when I played violin, a big part of that for me was I wanted to find a way to communicate with people and share like my experiences, my emotions, my thoughts. So I think broadcasting was just a obvious extension of that, right? While I was studying music, I always thought this would be something cool. But at the time, I guess the honest answer is I was more so interested in the actual production aspect of it, the editing, right, the planning, even the filming, right? If I had a chance to learn the technicalities of all that. So I think that's what always kept it on the radar for me. The act of commentating or yeah, being like in front of the camera, whether it's acting, that was never at the top of my list initially. It was more so the production. And then the only thing in front of camera would have been now and then I'd consider wanting to learn professionally to become a news anchor. So that was kind of the only thing that was specifically in my mind. But yeah, it's just something I think I always thought would be cool to learn. And now it, tied everything together.
Fortunately, not being able to speak Korean, I don't really have terrible insight into differences. But from the casual perspective, turning on TV and listening occasionally, well, one thing I can say is that even amongst the most suit and tie programs in America, there's always that element of drama, like
Yeah.
elaborate pageantry, I suppose,
Yeah. Yeah.
something like that. And you watch Korean and Japanese, I guess, like
Hmm.
East Asian, I guess. News, and it's not only the setup, but then you know anything about the language, and apparently they're speaking like a even more polite version of the language, so it's
Yes.
like it's
Yeah.
really structured. So I could to see that being totally different, and then I could also see it kind of, I don't know, bringing in a era of more like podcast shows, because we're talking about the 90s and 2000s, podcasts weren't a thing.
Right.
Radios, if you were talking about a radio DJ, you definitely were first of all thinking of some really wacky guy who was
Right. Yep.
excited all the time. But obviously podcasting now is super super accessible and popular, and a lot of it is because people do just kind of like listening to two people have a good conversation.
Hmm.
And it seems like you picked up on that even at an early age, perhaps with just the way that Korean media formed.
Yeah, no, I think so. But you're right. I mean, I've always been a big fan of the podcasting scene growing, right, into its various ways. I thought it provided just so much more variety of content for all sorts of different people. And like you said, it's just good, easy listening, right? And it's a great way to share different stories, different experiences. So it's great to
Yeah.
see.
And then, kind of the obvious question, perhaps, from that is: did you find yourself when you started getting into these more official roles of hosting? Because I know interviewing, for a while at the beginning was really just you literally just interviewed.
Hmm.
You just, or rather, you literally just translated. Sorry, and then you became an interviewer.
Right.
So when you became kind of the person who was the focus to an extent, and then you got into commentary as well, how much did you find yourself acting more like the Korean broadcasters versus some, the American
Uh,
influences?
that's something I still kind of think about a lot and try to balance out. Because I do think there's a lot of good things from the Korean side and the Korean style to learn even today, to bring into the English side. However, it's never a one-to-one, right? There's language differences, there are cultural differences, and you can't just say, oh, like that type of hype sounded good in Korean, let me do it in English. It just simply won't do the same thing. Initially, I think I focused very much so on just the English influences, whether it's the commentators that came before me, whether it's sports commentators, and for me, a big part of it, especially since, like you said, a lot of my main gigs were interviewing or hosting, right, on the stage or on the desk. A big part was talk shows, right, especially late night talk shows, just the kind of semi-casual tone. But still knowing when to kind of pull back if you need to. So that's where I got most of my inspiration and I guess modeling after. Commentating is when I really started to look back at the Korean influences. And the honest answer is I still don't think I've found a good way to mix the two together. I think when I cast in English, I still just absolutely default into what I'm used to hearing from the English side. But every now and then, especially with Valorant right now, Valorant actually, the styles are very different. And I feel this every day because I'll have a week where I'm like commentating in Korean one day and then English. And then I just kind of flip flop each other day. And my brain kind of struggles for the first map. I'm like, oh, yeah, like I got to switch gears a bit on what I want to say and how I want to say it. But Valorant, it's been a fun challenge of thinking, all right, how do I bring in the pros of each side to my other language when I'm commentating? But yeah, and then some people will say, well, the way you were hosting on stage, it seemed like obviously there was a big influence from, Caster Jun, who a lot of people know as the Korean hype guy. And that's true. I thought, because the way he did it, I thought worked regardless of language, right? People couldn't understand it and they were still like, oh, this guy's like really hyping up the show. Like it just delivered. And there were parts that I definitely tried to learn from that and do it properly in English. And I will admit, I think certain events were a bit of a flop, right? I kind of stretched it a bit too much, but other ones I thought I found the right balance and people seem to really enjoy it. So it's an ongoing struggle, but initially more so the English and American influences for sure.
Do you have any peers, contemporaries, anyone that you talk to about this who also are bilingual casters?
For casting, not so much. But obviously for interviewing and translating, especially early on, I would have many conversations with Smix, Sue, and especially for me, it was always funny because for me, at the beginning of my career, I would learn a lot by watching Sue's stuff because she had started before me within the StarCraft 2 scene. So I was like, oh, like she's doing this really well. Oh, she gets how to translate this type of stuff. This is really cool. But then once I started translating League of Legends, I later learned that Sue was, trying to reference my stuff, and both of us were just trying to learn from each other without ever really having talked to each other in the beginning. So that was a kind of a neat moment where I was just like, well, this is a nice peer to have, right? We both clearly respect each other's work, and it's something where it's unique, right? We can't just talk to anybody and they'll be able to really get where we're coming from. So translating and like interviewing, I've talked with, I think, Sue a lot. In terms of commentating, I mean, in general, like even right now, I cast a lot with Tasteless. So Tasteless and I will have a lot of talks. Back in the day, I used to even live with Monty when we were casting League of Legends together. So Monty and Doa, and also getting to see them work as a duo from close, where I never really had a static duo, was something I learned a lot from. But the bilingual casting is, not something that I've had the opportunity and honor to talk as openly with, right, with someone else. And in some ways, it's a good opportunity for me, right? It's clearly very unique. And I'm very thankful for that opportunity. But at the same time, yeah, there are difficulties where if I run into a challenge, I kind of find myself saying, okay, well, I got to figure this out, right? There's no one else I can really talk to unless I try to piece, different parts from both sides. I like talk to the Korean casters and then the English casters. So that's about the only option.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking now of seeing more people who are actually doing both casting of English as well as their native language.
Yes.
Quite a few people in Valorant actually. But I think also what would be different is that not to just like come out and say like I know all about these like other countries and their native languages casting, because I don't. But I think it can kind of be agreed upon that because of Brood War and the way that it was in Korea, how big it was compared to any other esports out there. Korea has a set esports broadcasting commentary. Like it's developed over time, and it's developed with some of like the best, the brightest. Where a lot of other languages basically are, I feel like, still kind of fumbling through things. And this is also, not just me. I feel like I have talked to other people who do like the B streams or the foreign language streams, sorry. And they also say like, well, I like this thing about that one and this thing about that one. I think this like what's limiting about my language and stuff like that. So anyways, I just wanted to say that I feel like you're also trying to appeal to some very, very high standards on both sides of the commentary, because it does seem to be either rampant. The English broadcast is kind of seen as the most coveted one,
right?
Or it's historic and prestigious, like the Korean broadcasting is. So it can be very tough. I can see it being very tough for you.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I think a lot of people, especially these days, either forget or just don't know because of time, is that the Korean space started with TV, right? And that comes with both positive and negative connotations, but it comes with a very set standard of this is what it needs to be. This is what we strive to be. And these are the rules of commentating, right? And yes, there have been some, new Pathfinders and whatnot that kind of paved new ways, but that's something that, for instance, the Korean, I think, commentary today struggles with a bit, where everything has now gone much more digital. Everything is much more open and kind of free flowing. And it's something that the Korean commentators, we talk about together for Valorant a lot, of where do we match this balance? Clearly, there are pros that we should keep from the old ways, but the audience has changed. The scene has changed. People are used to watching streams on YouTube. So how do we appeal to that? Because that's something that they'll want to see. And we see this, with the way co-streams work for different games, right? There's clearly an appeal to a bit more of that relaxed nature. Some people still want the very kind of structured hype. And there's a good balance to strike there. So yeah, I think that's the other thing, not just the history and the time, but the fact that it started with TV and there were certain unspoken requirements of what it needed to be like, and trying to match that and kind of switch back and forth is obviously not that easy.
Right. Yeah. And I think it helped as well tie esports broadcasting in Korean so much to the TV counterpart. Whereas I feel like for English commentary of esports, it is a lot more like homegrown. And then eventually people started to look at what could I do that they're doing correctly. So that's fascinating that there's gonna be the next new age problem, which you might get more into. But I do want to choose this time. You're talking about some of the old fashioned things and the new things. Your thoughts on duos versus trios, because Korea is very well known for trios, but English commentary definitely not.
Yeah, this is something it's very dear to my heart, because obviously, having worked in Korea at different times, I've seen it close up. I've been part of different Korean casts. Obviously, now in Valorant, we always cast as 3 on the Korean side and always cast as 2 on the English side. And here's the bottom line. I firmly believe that trios will always have a higher potential. Well, okay, always. I'm going to stick with always. I was just about to say maybe not for certain genres, because I'm thinking, like, I can see FGC games maybe not necessarily being that much better as a trio just because of the pace of the game. But in general, I think the potential is always higher. However, it comes at the cost of there is just so much more prep and chemistry and also just kind of luck of the different, mix of people required to meet that potential. And I think that's the hard part. And I think that's why it's always been, that's why people strive for trios in Korea, because Korea has always run mostly leagues. And so it's iteration after iteration, day after day, week after week for a whole year, 2 years, if the game continues to grow, 10 years, where you can really work on that craft. But then if you're, in the West and the game is mostly focused around events, you just simply don't have that opportunity, right? And you can try to get together and do, mock casts or, cast other games off of VODs. You can do that, but it's never going to be the same as being next to each other, working on the same game, same teams, same stories, and also individually growing and kind of seeing where each person's individual vision is. I think that's just really hard. So my argument has always been, listen, if you have an environment where you can create a league, it's going to be the set cast for a certain amount of time. I think trios is absolutely worth striving for. But again, it needs that perfect environment, because otherwise, yes, the risks are just simply greater. I mean, even with 2 people, sometimes, us as casters, I'm sure, sometimes it just doesn't feel right? And you just don't know where to go. And you're like, how do I pick up from this comment? Like, where do I go with this? And when it's 3, it's, there's just one more person to worry about. But if you have the right environment, what I really like about the Korean trio system is that it actually makes it easier to have a division of roles. And therefore, I think each person's job is harder to learn at the beginning, but much easier to shine later on as well. And it's a greater balance for the listeners as well and viewers as well, because so the Korean system is always, there's one who in Korea they call the caster, and then the rest are the commentators. So basically, I guess typically would translate to play-by-play and then commentators. But the caster is really just like an anchor, right? The Koreans like to think of it as, the Korean casters, we always like to think of it as, a really good cast should have the caster or the anchor talk like very minimal. They should literally only talk when absolutely necessary, or like if it's Valorant, when a round starts, right? And the rest should just be the 2 commentators that just continue on. And that means the commentators are not just analyzing, they're also doing the story building. They're also doing kind of the, reading things off the screen. So it's, at that point, it's still kind of very similar to what we're used to as a duo in an English cast, right? Where you just kind of pick up from each other, you have different knowledge bases and you trade off of that. But what I like about that is that means when the anchor speaks, it's a very important moment, right? Whether it's for hype, whether it's because the half has changed. And that simple voice change makes a very stark note of, this is what we're talking about now. We're talking about the next thing coming up. Right now, you need to focus on the action. It doesn't matter how deep the strategy goes. Right now, the action is what's important. The analysis can come later. And then that also allows the commentators to now buy time for each other to really dive deep. So, for instance, for Valorant, kind of what I've come to do is whenever I cast, depending on who I cast with, I try to that day tell myself, okay, this is what I'm focusing on. If I'm casting with Inho, who some people might recognize his voice, he's casted basically pretty much every game in the history. I think he's casted over like 150 or 200 game titles in Korea, which is absolutely insane. He's been casting for 20 years, but he focuses a lot on macro strategy. That he loves looking at macro strategy, and generally I do too. But when I cast with him, I say, okay, well, he's obviously got kind of the main grasp of Korean commentating. That's his thing. So then what can I do while he's racking his brain the whole match about what is the strategy, what is their movement? Okay, my focus is now on what does his individual movement mean? Why is this player standing here? Why did this player look away? Was it to avoid a flash? Was he looking for a different skill? So then I focus on that. That way, when he finishes his macro strategy and I see moments pass, I can fill in those gaps. Because especially in a game of Valorant, it is just way too much information for one person to parse on their own. And some will argue like, well, you can do that as a duo, right? You can, but at a certain point, one of you is going to have to basically fill the space or create the hype, right? And that's just time lost of being able to deliver more and therefore have more, I guess, pieces to build stories with. So that's why I've always liked the trio system. And I think back in the day, I know these days in Korea, there's actually a lot of I'll put it lightly, as debate about the Korean casters for League of Legends in Korea. But I think back in the day, that was still the vision as well of, let's have this division, right? And each person has a unique role. Sometimes one of the commentators, it's not their analysis at all, right? Maybe they're there for stories and humor, and that's fine. But it just adds another layer that you can push onto someone else, and it creates a bit of an even balance.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear. I don't think I've had the fortune of having someone break down a Korean casting. I've mostly just heard like snippets.
Mm-hmm.
So that's putting me into a almost believer state. As someone who's tried trio casting like online, it's terrible. As someone who, the only way StarCraft ever gets trio casting is there's one BlizzCon where that happened, but that was very rare.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's Home Story Cup, which means that you have, I, I guess kind of like what you're saying is kind of like the anchor that is usually the actual commentator that's hired to go there, and then two pros that are just not going to say anything until they have something to say.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, well, that just is awkward because we're not talking about people who are main jobs are to,
right,
I don't know, do this thing, right? But so that's not good. But then you put it in a way that I'm like, okay, I actually absolutely see what you're saying, and I think what it does do is it further convinces me that yes, it would only work on certain games. And weirdly enough, not because of the fast pacing. Actually, I feel like, I don't know. I feel like honestly, it might be very difficult in StarCraft 2, which has a lot of downtime.
I could see that.
Yeah. Where it's just like there's actually not much for anyone to say. So, then one person especially doesn't say very much because you try and get a three-way conversation started and it just kind of turns weird. But in Valorant, 100%, there's so much happening at all times that I could see how absolutely incredibly helpful it would be to have someone kind of talk while one person looks macro, one person looks micro. Actually, coincidentally, last guy I interviewed was Rocket League, and he said that they're also experimenting with trios now.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah, and I wonder how much that's going to kick off. And initially, I was kind of like, oh, fast-paced game like Rocket League? Geez, that doesn't sound right. But I don't know, the way that you're explaining it, that makes total sense. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, there's potential for sure.
I absolutely believe it. And I do think that I also think that you were right with like the highest potential, because then I said it then too, I'll say it again here. I imagine it being like three people working in synergy, just all that blend of voices and differences.
Yes.
Would be amazing. It'd be almost like a spectacle to hear. Where two people is kind of I don't know, mundane. So that's really cool. You talked to kind of a couple times mentioned the word rules. So how do you really what do you mean by rules? Are we talking about literally play by play and color and hosting, or did you said it like macro and micro? Where do you say roles belong in commentary?
So especially in duos, I am not a huge fan of having strict role divisions. Now, if those are your strengths, that's fine, right? You can work around that. I think that's fine. The only thing is, I think let's say if you're in a duo where you're very strict about, okay, I am play by play and you are color, right? If that's a strict division you have, you just run a greater risk of running into this problem where sometimes you just miss stuff, right? Or you don't know if the game maybe just isn't that interesting. How do you cover that? Because the play-by-play is like, well, okay, this isn't very hype. And then the color is like, well, there's really not much to talk about at all in this game. And then good duos will find other ways of chemistry, right? Whether it's humor, whether it's anecdotes, whatever it could be. But I think there's a greater risk of being more mundane, like you said. And also, running into scenarios you never imagined and not knowing how to recover from that because you're each thinking in your very own kind of viewpoint. So in duos, I like to think it more as like kind of leaning, right? You're leaning more towards this side. I'm leaning more towards this side. Obviously, you still want someone to basically be the quote unquote host, right? They open the show, they close the show. That's how people know. They open the match, they end the match, things like that. So that person would be generally more leaning, ideally, towards kind of the hype, the play-by-play, right? Or just the hosting itself of, all right, this is round what or map what, right? All that. Whereas then the other person should ideally be leaning more towards color. And again, their color style can vary. I mean, in a duo, you only have that one other person, right? Whether they're more stat based, whether they're all about the in-game analysis, whether they're more about, you know, history and story building, that's fine. I think any of those work. You just need to make sure that if you have a specific style, ideally, some styles are better suited for certain matches. I'll put it that way, right?
Mhm.
Some people will hate this. I think a lot of the hardcore fans will hate this, but if I had to choose between a hardcore analysis, in-game analysis person and a kind of overall story-based color commentator for a finals, I would choose the story-based. Just because, to me, I mean, most eyes are on there. If you're watching it, you're watching it anyway, right? I want this to be more about the moment, and the analysis can wait, in my opinion, for a finals. Now, other games, obviously, you know, there is going to be more importance on that because it builds up into the next match. But the finals, that is the last match. So, but that's an extreme case. Now, in trios, for us in Korea, there's a strict division of the host, the anchor, right? The caster, as the Koreans call them. So they do all the openings, right? They introduce all the graphics. They introduce each map. They lead us in. They're the only ones that are getting the comms from the producer, and the rest of us we just kind of riff for the rest of it, right? And once we go in game is when the commentators really just dig in. Like during all the graphics, yes, we'll help build the story and whatnot, but we're just waiting. We're just waiting for the game to begin, and then once the game starts, there isn't a strict division between the two commentators that are left. And I think that's why it's been, while it's a great, there's great potential, it's been hard for new Korean commentators to enter the scene. Because if you're entering a game like Valorant, like League, or even StarCraft 2, where, you know, the game is big, it's had its history, then it's going to have Tricast all the time in Korea. That's just a given. Now, for a newer commentator to enter a TriCast and have to deal with just the idea of casting live in a studio to begin with, but then having to learn to work with two other people and then try to figure out, okay, what is that other commentator's style? Because they came before me, so I have to match that and then figure your own out where you don't even know yet exactly what your style is. I think that's very difficult, and it's a very high bar. And I think it's almost impossible for someone new to learn on their own, right? I think they absolutely need mentorship. And I've had similar conversations with various people in Korea as well about how hard it is to enter that. But there's no strict division. And for me, I've been fortunate on the English side of, I've just had the honor of working with so many different games, so many different commentators of different styles, that I like to think that I'm fortunate enough that I can identify styles quite quickly. So even on the Korean side, I just say, okay, like this guy actually, he just knows how the pros movement. He's a high rank as well. He knows why they're standing there. He's all about individual mechanics. Okay, now I can focus on the macro that I really like. But then if I'm working with, like I said, you know, he's all about the strategy and he knows more than I do. He's talked with the teams more. I mean, he's been working the game since it came out in the very beginning. Then I tell myself, okay, what else can I learn to make this broadcast better? Because me trying to talk about the same things, then we're just going to take away from each other's time, right? And it doesn't help anybody. So while some people can say it feels unfair, it's literally up to me on whether this broadcast grows and I get to keep, my spot and really shine on my own as well. Because otherwise, we'll just eat away at each other's airtime. So that part's hard. There's no strict, no one's decided it for anyone. No one's like mentioned it going into a cast. We kind of just have to pick up from each other as we go and figure it out.
I've had a lot of conversations with first time co-commentators where it is just like, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? And almost always, I don't know, in my experience, it's like, well, kind of both. It's just always the answer anyways. So I'm just like, what's the point of even asking? But it is the truth, like if I'm lost, I'm not going to overreach. And if you know what you're talking about, then you go for it. If I'm really excited, I'm going to go. And then if you're really excited, you go, whatever. So yeah, it's funny that there's a decent amount of talk about, whose role is what.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people are quite accepted. They just, it's hybrid almost across the board, it feels like.
Yeah.
So
yeah. No, I think that's the that's where it will end up, right? Is that everyone to survive, you'll have to be hybrid. Now, like you said, I do think it's important to always have that conversation, though. And even if initially the answer is, well, kind of both, I think it's important to continue that conversation, because eventually, humans, we eventually become honest, right? Initially, we're not even sure of what we want, but eventually we'll figure it out. And I think it's important to have that conversation. I can only speak to my experiences, but I guess the biggest, most recent one was, again, I cast a lot with Tasteless on Valorant. We have some rotations, but it's mostly with Tasteless, and we talk about this all the time. Every time we meet up for food or drinks, we're talking about, okay, how did our last cast feel? What do we want to try in our next cast? What do you feel comfortable with now? Did you change anything? Did you learn anything new? Are you trying anything new? Or even the day of, I'll be like, hey, by the way, today, Nick, I want to try this. And he'll be like, okay. And then we'll try it. And he'll be like, listen, I don't think that really worked as well as we hoped. And I'd be like, you know what? I agree. I listened to it back. I think these are the things I could fix. At the same time, I think if you could kind of set me up this way, it'd be even better. And we even talk those specifics. We'll be like, we don't like script it, obviously, because you can't. But I'll just say, hey, this style of toss or this style of question really helps set up what I want to talk about. And then vice versa. He says, well, if you end it on this note, I can actually add on much more or lead into the next topic smoother. So I think those conversations are very important. But again, we are fortunate to be working consistently on a league, right? On a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And that's a huge benefit we have here in Korea.
Right. And I love the way that people who live in Korea and cast in Korea talk about these conversations. Because for those who have never been there and aren't involved, like they're constantly hanging out with each other, and they just it's also casual. And if you've listened to all the like Tasteless and Paper Thin or Tosis interviews here, like you guys could probably remember those conversations as well, where it's just like they get together and they talk, which is awesome. Quite envious. So even if it's not a league, actually, or it's like a guest commentator or something like that, there's still that natural conversation that also really, I think, reduces the stress factor, because like it's like you're at a CVS drinking outside, not right before the grand finals. Hey, you kind of fucked up there. Should be really, really bad. But anyways, one question I have about the traditional broadcasting you're interested in, did Korea, for its sports commentating, Korean sports commentating, is it also duos or trios?
Not always. A lot of times it actually is duos. I believe for soccer, it's almost always duos. Maybe not for the World Cup, but I believe it's almost always duos. So for sports, it is not always trios, but there are quite a few. For instance, I know like a lot of golf leagues in Korea actually have trios. And I think like the Olympics, oftentimes basically what they'll do is they'll have the host and then the professional commentator, and then like an ex-pro, right, for the Olympics. So that's how they'll do the trio, where that is a different tone. It's more of a guest, right? But still, so I think, it's widespread enough that that's probably where it came from for Korean esports, but it's not as much of a mainstay in my experience as it is in esports now.
Okay. I wonder where that divide happened, since it was, taken so much from traditional television.
Yeah, I'm actually not so sure about the sports side now that you mention it.
Well, get someone who's into Korean
sports
commentary, very specific on the broadcast. But no. So while looking at either American or Korean or what have you, do you take any inspiration from traditional broadcasting, or the things that you think that esports still hasn't really met up to or does differently better? Either one.
Yeah, I've used to listen to a lot of different sports on the English side a lot. These days, not as much. I'll tune in now and then, where I'll find clips, right, if I see them floating around. But I still believe there's still a lot to learn from. I know, some people in esports I know are still very wary of either, quote unquote, becoming like traditional sports. And I don't think that you need to do that. I don't think we need to copy sports. But listen, if this is a thing that's been built up for decades, and it's clearly worked, I think there are things to take from that, even if the generations have changed, because clearly it worked, right? It worked. Something about it worked. And while generations have changed, the core part of it is that it is a sport, a competition, and it's entertainment. So there's got to be something to learn. I think for me, I used to actually really, I've never really had any interest or knowledge of hockey, but I've always found listening to hockey commentary very interesting because the pace of that sport is very different than a lot of other sports. And to me, sometimes I could really pick out parts just without understanding hockey of like, oh, this is like this time of League of Legends. Oh, this is more, okay, this is where they would kind of treat this more as there's not much going on. You're waiting for a gank, whatever. And then these are the team fights. And I'd like to try to pair that moment and see how did they do, control their pacing and tone in a sport like this, where if you don't know the sport, it seems very hectic all the time, right? And action packed all the time. But in reality, sometimes they're talking as if there's not much going on. And I'm like, okay, well, why do they do that? And how do they make that work? It doesn't make me question the commentators. It just makes me wonder, like, oh, this is kind of cool. Okay, it's not that hype right now. Clearly, I'm learning hockey right now. That's cool. And I'd listen to that. It's the same in, I would say, like basketball is kind of similar in my opinion, where any of these sports that are in much more close quarters, so there's always some action. But even basketball, if you know basketball, you know that, okay, they made a basket, it goes over to the other team, they dribble it down, they pass, they shoot, they make a basket. It's not a big deal, right? It happens every day. It happens all the time. So there's no need to hype up every single layup, right? It's just going to happen. So how do you decide that, right? And how do you make sure that delivery is separate? I think things like that, there is stuff to pick up from where it's not a one-to-one, but it makes you think about, okay, what can I do differently in esports, right? For instance, if it's Valorant, all right, it's an eco round. How do I make this not interesting but fun? And then if an upset does happen, if they do get a thrifty, right, if they do get an eco steal, okay, now how do I find the right timing to say, oh, this was crazy? Because until now, I just told you it wasn't, right? So how do I flip that switch? Things like that. I think delivery is where there's still a lot to learn. And also for me, I find that listening to sportscasting keeps me grounded on the fact that at the end of the day, this is entertainment, right? Especially now in Valorant, for the first time, I'm like fully focused on analyzing the game and learning the game. Whereas before, a lot of my roles were hosting, even in a commentary duo, where sometimes I find myself losing track, right? And I get a little too deep, right? And I get a little too deep into the game. And I say, yes, this knowledge is good and it's important, and some people will appreciate it. But in the grand scheme of things, when I look at the majority of the listeners, this isn't what's going to keep them liking watching Valorant, right? This one strat that I called, that's not going to be what they think about when they're watching Valorant again next year. They're going to be thinking about like, oh, that match was cool. Like that was a cool upset, or man, I didn't expect that play, right? It's the hype that they'll remember.
Well, now there was that one time Apollo called the mech transition from a proxy 4x.
Okay, there are times, especially if you predict it, there are times where it can be very cool. But yeah, again, I mean, even that though, right? There's a balance of you don't always want to get ahead of yourself. And I think stuff like that you can learn from sports. I really think so, especially because sports, the rules don't change all the time, whereas games patches happen all the time, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So sports have that benefit of they've been able to just work on that same craft for decades. There's clearly something we can learn from there.
I agree. I think that there are many reasons why it is approached differently, from the casting and broadcasting, but even from like the fan perception. Like I do, and this has to somewhat to do with me not being a sports ball watcher so much, but certainly I've talked to people who agree that basically like there's something about esports that makes it even more, I feel like, likely that the casual viewer would be like boo the commentators, where I feel like for a casual listener just turn on the radio to listen to a football game, there's not a lot of interest in the commentators. It's like they're there,
Yes.
but obviously you dig deeper and people absolutely have their preferences and absolutely rag on this poor guy. But just across the board, it seems a little like more likely you just get kind of like a, okay, yeah, they're talking. And you could dissect that and talk about like the weird feeling of like I could do that happens in esports with everyone being so easy to do, and that is easy to like, you can have obs, you can have a mic, but anyways, but also you could say it's because the sports broadcasters have some quality that is worthy of trying to also attain. And I did actually take a couple lessons with a guy who would teach traditional sports broadcasters, and some of the things that he would explain, it kind of blew my mind. And I had trouble replicating it, even though it sounded so simple when he said it, like the way they're pacing,
Right.
as you were talking about. So there's something really good about it. And final note from me on this topic is that it's also like you're like the fourth or fifth person that's brought up hockey
Oh,
commentary as
really?
like the
Okay.
go-to. Seriously. So first of all, I got a guy who actually he works with the Tampa Bay Lightning.
Oh, okay.
He like reached out and he's like, I think I could provide some experience and perspective. And I was like, absolutely, come on. So you guys can check that out. I don't remember what episode it was. But then the Rocket League guys, so both that I've been
Mm.
in, or all three of them actually, I've interviewed three of them. They've all brought up hockey.
I could definitely see that. Yeah, for Rocket League, I
Yeah.
could definitely see that.
Yeah, and I mean, some of them pointed out because
Interesting.
like there's like a rink which is kind of more identical to Rocket League with the
Right, with the
force field or
arena.
whatever that is
Yeah.
around them. But then others just brought up the same thing, which is they've always appreciated how hockey commentators are able to say things basically.
Yeah.
So I know there's something there. I should start watching hockey.
Yeah,
Enough
interesting.
people have
Wow.
brought it up. But yeah, so we're actually like quickly running out of time. So I just wanted to
Mhm.
go through a couple of points that you were really happy to talk about. And I do think this one that I'm bringing up in particular is something you are very special, like past. You can bring some real perspective into this. How you would hire commentators.
Mm,
So this has been a mostly just theoretical question to anyone I have asked in the past, but you have actually done so at ESL. So how
right.
did that process work, and what do you think is the ideal process for doing this?
So there's obviously a lot of factors to consider. But the first thing is, listen, if there are people that are already branded and experienced as a team, right? Duos, trios, whatever it might be, that's just a huge boost because then the overall product you're getting. Because if I hire two great individuals, I still don't know how is this going to go, right? You don't really have a good reference. So if they're in that game, if there's a duo or trio that I've seen that I've liked their work, and it's very clear they're working on their craft together, that's a huge boost. The other, this, just to put it very honestly and put a reality check for people, is yes, popularity does matter to a certain extent, right? If I'm doing a huge event and I get all new commentators, no matter how much I believe in their skill, it's going to have an impact on just the first impression. And that's just the reality of us all being human beings. But now that doesn't mean I've always wanted to always try to bring in new people whenever I can. I mean, listen, if it's like the world finals of a game, it might be hard simply because there's a limited number of spots. But if it's one of the qualifiers, I'll be like, and there are enough new people and I see some potential, I'll bring in like one, maybe two, and then I'll just kind of mix them in, wherever I can. Because otherwise, how will you ever learn, right? I had the same, opportunities given to me. So I come from that background. But after that, I'll be very honest. Listen, if at a certain point there's enough people, there's enough of a pool where people have enough skill, right? Yes, there's some minute differences, but okay, this list, they're all skilled people. They've done this for, who knows how many months, how many years. That's great. After that, a big part is, do I think that can I work with them well in creating a good broadcast and a product? Let's say there's a commentator that has a very strict vision of what they think commentating should be and how the game should be presented. It might be a good idea, but if my vision for this event just simply isn't that as a producer, and I'm trying to go a different direction, and I have other people I can pick, listen, I'm going to work with the others just because there's some new things I want to try. And having this hurdle to jump over, and even if you're willing, knowing that you've just never really wanted to do this, right? Is going to be a bit of a blockade. And to me, any production at the end of the day is a team effort. It's important to have your own style and your own color and your own spotlight. But I think that comes from once you're willing to work with each other and realize that we're all striving at the end of the day for the same vision, right? You want a good broadcast. We might have different styles, but you want a good broadcast. Okay, then within that, how do you say, okay, I get what the producer, I get what you want. I just personally, this is my style. This is what I like. How can we mix this together? That's the type of conversation I really liked having whenever I was producing. So that's the biggest thing. But Yeah, it's more about chemistry, both within the commentators and then with the production team. So
Mm,
if I'm hiring even all individuals, it's more about, okay, I have X number of
interesting.
people who are leaning more towards hosting. I obviously just need to fill the rest with a certain style. Maybe I have two people who I know are really great in-game analysts, but they're kind of dull, right, in their delivery. Okay, well, I need to mix it up with other people who are maybe just a bit more lighthearted and more about story and hype, even if they are color commentators. And it's, to me, it's always about the bigger picture.
So a good mix of people, both in
Hmm.
their roles as well as I guess the tone that they bring, and chemistry as well. So, for me, I can think of, as you said, like if there's a qualifier or a dozen qualifiers, you can just kind of start to mix and match, and that's a great way to foster improvement, find the gems you're willing to work with. But certainly, for when it comes to, let's kind of like bump it up a notch and be like a little more
Sure.
specific as well, to the people that are, let's call like them like the B streamers,
Hmm.
like they're
Sure.
on the
Sure.
radar. They are pretty good, and they're kind of well liked among the community, but not
Hmm.
like the demanding
Yeah.
to be on. How do they appeal more to the people doing the hiring? Like
Mm.
what brings that up? Okay, what makes these companies have like the same 8 people versus adding in someone new? If you have any insight onto that.
Um. So in an ideal world, you would just have a built out portfolio, even if it's of amateur stuff, and that in an ideal world that should do the trick. Now the harsh reality is not everyone hiring has a balanced background in both casting and production, which I think is needed to be able to make decisions purely off of the skill set that people
Mm,
bring. And I say both because I think that's absolutely true. I think you need an experience of having a viewpoint as a part of the production team, even if you're not the main producer, and then you need to have experience casting to understand if whatever they're doing is really good or not, right? Because otherwise, how will you know? Um, Now, again, the harsh reality is that that's not always the case when people are hiring. So then I think the other thing to do is just, I know it's the same thing people say, but you basically have to build out your portfolio in terms of sheer amount. At a certain point, I think the quality, it's hard because, listen, the people who are hiring, they're not always going to have the time to sit and listen to a full cast. And if they don't have experience casting, they're not going to know how to scrub that VOD of picking out where to listen to. And at that point, they're just not going to listen to it. I'm sorry, but it's the same as if you're applying to stuff, right? You need to know how to have a good resume and a cover letter because they're just going through it every day in, day out. So at a certain point, the sheer amount and then the presentation of it. So even if it's for a smaller tournament, right? The way you present yourself, the way your setup is, and yeah, sometimes that requires funding, but even with whatever you've got, right? How do you make it look the cleanest it can?
mm,
How do you make it look like you really mean to grow in this space? And maybe your portfolio actually shows that improvement, right? Of I used to do it like this, and here's how it's grown. Here's how I take casting seriously. I think those are the impressions you want to leave. There's always going to be an element of luck, right? As is with any job, there's always going to be an element of luck, and I'm sorry, I can't provide a better answer after that, but uh, I think the presentation is important, and it's. But here's the thing: if you think of it as if you wanted to stream or create a YouTube channel, it is the same thing, right? You're going to have to make a certain amount of investment to get that first good impression from the viewers. I think it's the same thing, and that's why getting into casting is hard. It's not something you can just study and say, "Hey, I passed the test. Let me get my first shot." Right? That's just
exactly.
not the truth. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the real tough. Even if you had a very competent hirer person that
Yeah.
did both things like you said and was just a sharp as a tack, there's not going to be a process. I mean,
Hmm.
maybe one day someone will try like an actual like how to say like here's here's this person, someone like wise choose who's better. But that's not really how it ever goes, because we haven't even talked about like the thousand and miscellaneous things.
Yeah.
Co-work, the co-commentators giving you the thumbs up, the thumbs down,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
elders kind of allowing you in, not exactly old boys club, but certainly like a seal of approval.
Yeah.
Um, just chemistry in general to each person that you might be going up to work with. Literally, the fact that you have not done a S tier event might be the reason you don't get an S tier event,
Right.
even though you might be S tier.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that type of stuff. It's just, you're right. It's a certain degree of luck.
I will just add though, I think on that note, I think it's very important for current commentators to remember this, right? Listen, it's not always easy for us to, somehow, give that seal of approval, because sometimes, it's going to reflect on us, obviously, as people who are already commentating. But it's also important to remember that, like, we're not going to be commentating forever. There's going to always need to be new commentators. And I think it's up to the people who are currently commentating on whether we actually help continue the growth, or whether it's always going to reset when there's a new game and new people, right? And they have to learn on their own again through a new generation. And at that point, I think the overall growth just slows down a lot. And it's a tough thing to think about, where in esports, most people are freelancing. And so whenever new people come in, yes, a piece of the pie is now divided once again. That is true. But ideally, the pie is still growing. So it doesn't have that big of an impact in the long run, right? So again, it's not an easy decision, but I think it's just important for all of us who are currently commentating to at least be conscious of this option, where if we do see someone who not only shows potential, but really shows the effort that they want to put in to learn properly, and build something greater, to foster that however you can. You don't have to give up your spot, but maybe it's a different game, maybe it's a different event, right? And say, hey, I was offered this, but my schedule doesn't work. Let me recommend you. Or, hey, you should try applying. If you don't feel that comfortable, say at least, hey, you should try applying to this one. Send them an email, because otherwise there's always going to be a certain amount of reset every time a new game comes out and a new group of commentators start to grow.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of segues nicely a bit into the final talk, which is the imposter syndrome. So we're talking a lot about how you're supposed to be appealing to these people, and how you may or may not actually deserve a chance or a spot. But have you dealt with this? Do you have any insight into it, and any advice people that find themselves dealing with it as well?
I deal with this a lot, actually, and I've never really talked about this openly before. But I've dealt with this a lot, and a big part of it comes from, I've just grown up always, partly because of my Korean background, always having to be like extra humble. But at a certain point, that humility goes from good to bad, right? And then I'm like, okay, well, maybe I'm not good enough. And I'm like, oh, maybe what I'm doing isn't special at all. And I'm like, okay, well, this is a problem. And then I start to doubt myself. And I mean, it's gotten to the point where sometimes I've like downplayed myself so hard that I've lost opportunities, right? And I just be like, oh no, like no, I'm not the guy you're looking for. I'd be like, I'm not the guy you're looking for. And then later I'm like, what? No, like they wanted to pay me to go. Like, why am I not going there? The biggest thing for me of overcoming this was, first of all, you want to surround yourself with a certain amount of peers that you can always talk to honestly, right? Not people who always tell you that you're doing well, but people who will give you criticism when you need it. That way, when there isn't criticism, or when they do compliment you, that they also mean it, right? Because otherwise they would have given you criticism. I think that's important. I think it's also important to have people that aren't as familiar with esports. Because here's the thing, the fact that you're commentating a video game and getting paid to do it in a world where gaming and digital content is growing is very cool. Like, that alone is actually really cool. And clearly not everyone can do it, whether it's skill, whether it's politics, whether it's luck. Not everyone has the opportunity to do it. And a lot of us who get involved in this, we go through this tornado of event after event, or trying to get event after event. And you just lose sight of that, and you just say, oh, well, I need to get better. I need to do the next big event, and I need to get to this spot. I need to cast the grand finals. Yes, it's a good goal to have, but even if you didn't, it's good to have an outside reality check of, no, what you're doing already is very cool. And if you're still striving, I think you're on a good path. I recently actually met someone who actually just didn't like gaming, thought gaming was bad, right? And they were like, oh, like, what is esports? But then after meeting with me and getting to talk, they were like, oh, esports is very interesting. I still don't get the gaming part, but esports is very interesting. And then they look at what I do and they're like, okay, the fact that you can commentate in 2 languages and you're doing it for a consistent league right now, even if you're not always getting, whether it's the number of matches or the types of matches you want, even if you're not getting to go to all the events you want, I think what you're doing is like crazy. And then you translate interviews. Like that's nuts. And they look at me and they're like, you're doing an amazing job. And then I listen to that, and at first my default is no. Like, you know, someone will always pick it up if I don't do it. But then I listen to what they're saying and I'm like, okay, no, you're right. Like this came because I worked on it. This came because I wanted to do it. And again, even the luck portion, even the timing, even the politics, it's all a result of what I've done. And I think it's very important to have an outside reminder, because within, it's very easy to always find a different excuse if you're talking to just people, you know, peers within the industry, of downplaying yourself and falling into that imposter syndrome. But I think it's very important for someone to have a objective look and say, no, I think it's really cool, right? And I would say the same thing for other fields that I'm not as familiar with, right? As you know, I recently met someone who was who's an architect, and they're like, yeah, you know, in the morning sometimes, you know, we go out in like a crew, and I feel really good, but then sometimes I'm like, oh, you know, or I'm just designing stuff again. I'm just looking at blueprints, and I'm like, no, I think that's really cool because not everyone can do that. And they're like, oh yeah, you know what, you're right, it is cool. It's important. It's important to have that objective reminder of your efforts, and that this is a result. It's a direct result. It may not be what you dream or thought how it would go, but it is a direct result.
I think that can really also just help the whole idea of seeing where you've come from and seeing where you
Yes.
are.
Yes.
You know, is really important. A lot of people need reminders of that and affirmation, good old fashioned, just like you know, positive talk. So I think that's, you know, absolutely what, you know, even therapists can really help you with. They
Yes.
are an
Yeah.
objective, you know, outsider perspective, and they just look in and they're like, well, here's the thing, here's factually what happens. So why do you feel this way? And then you can kind of work that out,
Mm-hmm.
which actually happened exactly to me, because it's not so much, I've never had imposter syndrome when it comes to StarCraft.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like because I was just in it so long that even when I got brought up, I was just like, yeah, like I know what I'm talking. I might not be as good, but I don't. That's fine. But getting into other games
Right.
and saying like, well, I have this, you know, base skill set, and I think I'm a good learner, and I know how to study, and I think I can do okay. Absolutely, just like terrible feelings of like, well, I'm definitely not as good as that guy, and I'm definitely not as good
Yeah.
as I thought I was.
Oh.
So I actually talked to someone about it, and you know, one of the things they brought up was like, okay, you got disappointed you didn't get this BlizzCon job, right? And I was like, yeah, I was like really bummed out. And they're like, yeah, but then you got this Katowice job, which you say that you wanted even more than that. And I was like, well, yeah, but hold on.
Right.
You bamboozled me into thinking I'm actually good and I got things that I want. So I think that was really, really helpful.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and it does give you, it's not going to magically fix things. You're not going to like always be in
Mm-hmm.
the, you know, the top of your game and mentally be like, I can do everything. But I think it is something, it's a reminder. So well, there's literally studies on how to like deal with imposter syndrome, right? So I'm not sure
Right.
we're gonna fix it
Yeah.
all right now.
The other thing I just want to add, though, for commentating is that, listen, a part of our job is faking it till you make it. Like, that's just the reality of it, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
you run into a game where you actually don't know what's going on, or it's a new game and it's your first time casting it. You're always going to feel that you're not prepped enough. And that's okay, because like that's part of the skill. A live broadcast, that's always part of the skill, right? It's always, how do you deal with a spontaneous situation? And the fact that you didn't mess it up is already an accomplishment. And I think that's something that we need to remember as well when we're doing live shows, is
Yeah.
that's just part of the nature.
Right. There's so many cases of people who are basically just very good at improv and navigating
Yes.
social situations, still being received very, very well. I think the biggest example of this is definitely, and I forget her name, so that's great. Dota 2 was a non-video
Casey.
game esports. Thank you, Casey. I was like
Yes.
K something.
Yeah.
But Casey, you know,
She was great.
and Dota 2 is actually one of the most like insanely detailed games and fan base as well. They want the analysis. They want the people who know, who've been there for a long time.
Hmm.
And she just came in and was like, I don't know, but I'm having fun.
Right.
And people love her. So,
Yes.
not saying that happens all the time and you're not going to get away with not knowing anything, guys, but to a certain degree, yeah, that is what your actual skill is. That's how you're going to get into a place where you can dedicate more time and, more work into whatever you're struggling with now. So, yeah, there you go. Kind of
There you
positive end note, I guess.
go.
About a very serious conversation, but wrapped up positively. But thank you so much for giving us all your experiences and insight into esports, both English and Korean broadcasting. You said you're going to be on, for Valorant for an extended period of time, so I assume that's also going to be continuing by the time this releases, which is like in a
Mhm.
month. So that plus anything else that you're doing, any place that people can follow you, all that good stuff.
I mean, you can find me on kind of the main social media platforms, right? Twitter and Instagram. Everything's Will Chobra. Same with my Twitch, which has kind of been deactive for the year, but and YouTube as well. I'm glad we had this chance to talk because I've actually been thinking about what kind of other content do I want to do on my own as well outside of commentating. And given the experiences I have, which I do find are unique, so if you're more interested in that, obviously, I'll have updates for that both on my Twitter and Instagram, and eventually on my content platforms as well. But you can find me most places if I do have an account as Will Chobra. If I'm not there, then I'm too lazy to do things like TikTok and other platforms.
Oh my god!
So yeah, that will be the limit of that.
So today they announced the Twitch exclusivity thing, and
Oh yeah.
people replying to it, and then a lot of people were saying like, "Well, absolutely, then go on TikTok live and do stuff there." And I'm like, no, even though it's a really good idea and apparently it's really good for your job. No, a bit whiny about it, but it sounds like perhaps there's another podcast in the works. Chobra and esports talk. I would listen.
Well, we'll see. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone who's listening and watching for just listening, I guess, for actually digesting, there we go, this content. But of course, thank you to everyone who supports me on the Patreon, patreon.com/ZombieGrub. Thank you to Shayne for co-producing and Barrett for helping out, reaching out, doing highlights, all that good stuff, as well as to the people who support above and beyond on Patreon. Nick, Vinny, Steven, ET, Ravi, and CuddleBunny. Appreciate all you guys everywhere out there. Hope you're having a wonderful day, and I hope you enjoyed listening to episode 59 with Chobra. So yeah, have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you back here for episode 60. Bye-bye.